Cambridge Insider Podcast time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cambridge Insider Podcast. I've taken a couple of weeks off, and it's been good. It's been refreshing. In my absence, things have gone wildly successfully, and that's thanks to my excellent co-host, Leanna. Thank you for steering the ship while I was gone.
No problem. We missed you a lot, but I do think we had some really great episodes while you were taking some time for yourself. But I know our listeners are very happy to have you back, as am I.
I hope so. I hope so. And if they aren't, hopefully they won't tell me that they aren't. So that's always a good thing. If you haven't listened to those episodes where Leanna was steering the ship, please make sure that you like, subscribe, have a look at the YouTube channel, find your podcast, and leave us some comments. Enlighten us with what you want to hear on the podcast and how we can assist you in this awesome world of international education. Then this afternoon, we're really, really privileged and I think very excited at the Cambridge Insider Podcast to welcome a special guest, Mandy Feuerbacher, who is the Executive Vice President of Sales and Consular Affairs for Argo. Mandy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys so much, Stephen and Leanna. It is a pleasure to be here. I love international education. My parents were international students, and so it's very near and dear to my heart. So it is an honor to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. We're excited because we are, wanting to share the most up-to-date information with all of our listeners and hopefully help them out. So we think this conversation is going to go a far way to doing that. Mandy, before we start, if you don't mind just maybe introducing yourself a little bit further, giving our listeners a little bit of an insight into yourself, but also into the type of work that you currently do.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I am the Executive Vice President of Argo. We are actually an immigration and visa startup. But I think what's most important about my background is I'm actually a former visa officer with the U.S. Department of State. And I worked as a visa officer, a U.S. diplomat, a consular officer, a visa officer. They're all sort of, synonymous in this situation for about 7 years. And I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, China, at a U.S. consulate in Matamoros, Mexico, and finally the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong. And I've made decisions on over 100,000 visa applications, interviewed so many people, and so have a lot of experience with not only, F1 and J1 student and visiting scholar visas, but also every other type of visa you can imagine under the sun, from H-1Bs to Ls to immigrant visas and green cards. And so, throughout this process, we just realized how misunderstood the visa interview it is, and just how important it is in a person's journey. If you're an international citizen and you're planning on coming over to the United States, for studies, for tourism, for work, you will likely be interviewed by a consular officer or visa officer at an embassy or consulate overseas. And if you don't, take advantage of these few minutes that you have in front of a visa officer who's, a US government official like myself or so many of my colleagues, it could be to your detriment. If you get refused a visa, it could really impact your relationship and your plans, in the United States. So it is a really big deal. And at Argo, we help international visa applicants prepare for the US visa interview process. And so right now we have 25 former visa officers who work with us. We're the first company in the world doing this. And the great thing about this is there's really a strength in our numbers. I might be an expert on US visas being applied for in China and in Mexico, but I have colleagues who have worked at the US consulate and embassy in India, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Guatemala, in France, in the UK. And so really, it's like all of our collective brains coming together to provide visa applicants the best service, to make sure that for this very important part of the process, you're not overlooking anything. You're not, not seeing some red flags that could be there. And then if you're asked about something at the visa interview, you can't just give like a deer in headlights look. You have to make sure that you're prepared to convince the visa officer that you should be able to get that visa approved.
Awesome. Well, after that introduction, we're excited to pick your brain and hopefully leave our listeners with a couple of insights. And to all of our listeners, don't panic. We're going to have executive producer Dean put in the show notes all of the links to Argo where you can get in touch with Mandy and the wonderful services that they provide. So Mandy, kicking us off then, I think that the question that a lot of people are wondering is, what, if anything, has changed during this COVID era, during this COVID time with the visa interview process?
Yeah, so COVID has really wreaked havoc on the State Department and the embassies and consulates overseas. When we saw everything come down at the beginning of 2020, it was the very first time that the State Department has basically told all US diplomats, visa officers included, hey, if you are concerned about your safety in this international country, you are welcome to come back to DC, and we welcome you to do that. So there was about a third of staff at the time that actually ended up leaving their posts overseas and coming back domestically and working for the State Department. The State Department also canceled routine visa services, which is why for so many of our clients, you can't get a visa interview. You're sitting there at your computer, you're just hitting refresh, trying to find that visa interview slot. So a lot of that was stopped. Things have slowly started to get back into, sort of a swing of things. The State Department has prioritized student visas, over time, starting in July or August of last year. A lot of our Indian national clients were finally able to get student visa interviews, and it's still, there's still work to be done, but it's definitely getting better. The State Department and actually the White House has announced earlier this week that basically they're going to be getting rid of the travel bans for visitors who are fully vaccinated. So that's kind of an important step and progress in the right direction. And so I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is just people not being able to travel bans being put into place because of COVID, no visa appointment availability. A lot of people leaving the State Department even, so there's not enough officers to handle the workload. And then even as embassies and consulates started slowly reopening back up to handle student visas, there's a lot of safeguards that they have to put into place. It used to be when I worked at the US Embassy in Beijing, we would have around 4,000 people come through our waiting room every day. Everybody had to be fingerprinted and interviewed by a visa officer. Now in the, in the middle of the pandemic, they have to be concerned about social distancing, and, people can't be standing right next to each other. So it has, caused a lot of problems for the State Department in trying to get things back on track. And I think what we've also seen is because visa appointments are limited, interestingly enough, from what we've heard from clients and just, being in these circles, is that visa officers are actually taking a lot more time with each applicant. And so, people used to be very used to very short interviews. Perhaps you're a first-time student visa applicant. You get your visa approved in just a couple of minutes because, visa officers are very, very focused on efficiency. I used to have to interview about 150 people a day. So you had to make sure, everybody was kind of going through. But now, because there's limited appointment availability for people who might have a potential issue in their background, maybe they were refused before, they're having some of their interviews are 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And this is just incredibly surprising, I think, for visa applicants, because this hasn't happened before. This is not what they were told to expect. And so a lot of times, visa officers are drilling down into more specific situations. What exactly is your family background? Why do you want to study in the US? And it could sound a little bit like a firing squad, but you want to be prepared for some of these lengthier interviews where they want to go a little bit deeper than just the 3 or 4 questions that they used to ask.
Yeah,
Mandy, if I could just ask you a quick question, just based on that feedback, do you think it's accelerating acceptances for visas to have more time with the officer during the interview, or do you think it's causing students to have more issues to have that longer interview period?
I think it really depends. If you are a student who is extremely well prepared and, say you're a high school student and you just happen to go in for your visa renewal, you've lived in the US for 4 years, you speak absolutely fluent English, you could chat with the visa officer all day because they'll ask you about your hobbies. Maybe sometimes they throw some curveballs at you. You'll probably be fine. But for other students who are hoping, maybe they're going to study English as a second language overseas. They were hoping to be asked just a few simple questions. They just want that interview to be over and done with so they can get their visa. They would be in for kind of a big surprise because the visa officer has more time. They want to know more about you. They want you to be responding in English, even if you don't really know English. And so this could be problematic for people. So I think a little bit of both, but I think in general, people are going to see more visa refusals because the more questions visa officers ask, generally it raises more questions in the back of their mind if an answer doesn't really make sense and they want to find out more about something. And the more they know, sometimes the less confident they feel in approving a visa.
So Mandy,
Yeah,
then, it would be amiss of me not to ask, as a big part of what we do at Cambridge, of course, is to represent our schools as well. And I think there was a lot of frustrations with the US schools with accepting students who then were not able to get visas.
Yes.
Is this the new normal, considering potentially COVID is here to stay in some form or another? Social distancing might be something that's sort of here to stay. Is this the new norm that the speed of visa processing will remain what it is currently, maybe a little bit quicker, but certainly not where we were pre-pandemic levels? Or are we hoping for things to go back to pre-pandemic levels? What are you hearing from the industry and seeing from the industry?
I think we will eventually go back to more of a normal, similar to what was pre-pandemic, because I think we're all just getting used to basically living with, COVID and knowing that it's going to be around for a while. Once for example, they still don't have routine visa services right now. They're doing student visas and then, they're allowing certain people to get expedited visa appointments, but they're really not doing tourist visas. And again, this depends on the embassy or consulate because right now, embassies and consulates, some of them are sort of making their own rules because they're not getting, feedback from the top down. And so I would say that eventually we will go back to a normal, but just be prepared that in the next couple of years, 2 or 3 years, it's going to look a little bit different, for people applying for visas.
Okay, that's some excellent information, specifically, I think, for our schools that, were very frustrated. So, Mandy, let's get down to basics then, because one of the things we often hear and some of the concerns that we hear are what should students be doing in these visa interviews? So, are there some common mistakes that you see students or applicants do that lead to failures in terms of applying for visas?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question because I get asked this all the time. And I think students usually, a mistake that students commonly make is, and what we advocate for at Argo is being a very proactive participant in your visa interview. Most students, because, they've never had to come face to face with a US government official, we have this like bulletproof glass between us. It's a very stressful situation, but they kind of just go in and they just wait. They hope to be asked the right questions that will showcase the positive aspects of their case. And visa officers just don't have time to do that. They're trying to get through cases. They're trying to get to the next person that they have to interview. And so I think my biggest tip for international students is don't be a passive interviewee. Don't just hope they'll ask you, hey, did you get a scholarship to this school? Or, what are some accolades that your father got, in his position, as a executive at a big company. You want to make sure that you are sort of taking every single question that you get and being able to come back with something that will reflect positively on your situation. One other thing that I always see students get wrong is, and I think they're misinformed by other visa agents or maybe even by immigration attorneys who don't really know the process, is they give very short one-word answers. That is so frustrating because when you're a visa officer, you're trying to get information out of this person so you can support either an approval or a refusal in the computer system. You're typing up notes about what's going on. We used to ask, why are you going to the United States? Study. Well, the visa officer already knew that because they see your I-20. Clearly, you're a young person. You're going, maybe to a school in the United States that you've already applied to, but you haven't given the visa officer any more information that they could use to support approving your visa. And you would be surprised to hear how many clients who come to us and they got a massive scholarship and a huge opportunity to study. It's a chance of a lifetime. And they never even brought up the fact that they got a scholarship at the interview. And this is very problematic because I think, people can plan, university DSOs and immigration attorneys and visa agents can prep all they want, but at the end of the day, it is an interview that happens between the visa officer and the visa applicant, him or herself. And they really have to step up to the plate and know what to say, answer questions. You don't want to leave any lingering questions in the mind of the visa officer, because that will get them to slowly think, maybe there is a problem in this case. Maybe I need to look into it further. And sometimes, even if you're not refused a case, you might be put into something called a 221G administrative processing status, which basically means it's impending status. The visa officer is basically saying, I can't make a decision right now because I need to look into this case more. But guess what? Once you get put into that pending status, it is much more likely that your visa will be refused versus approved. Because if the visa officer takes that case back to their desk, you don't have a pair of hopeful eyes looking at you through the window, looking at what, waiting for the decision. They might just say, okay, I looked into it, I decided to refuse the case, but it's a much easier refusal at that time because you don't actually have to explain to the person. That person will just literally get a notification like, hey, come pick up your passport and a letter, and you've been refused. And I know it's a terrible feeling for international students to go through.
Definitely. And what I'm hearing from you is that it's really kind of like a job interview for these students, that you want to make the most out of what you're saying. Every single chance you get an opportunity to speak on behalf of yourself, you really need to jam pack it full of information and make sure that you're not leaving that interview without having explained to the officer every single detail about the opportunity you have to study in the US. And I agree. I mean, it's such a devastating thing to happen for your visa to be rejected. Is there any way to find out why your visa was rejected, and so that at your next attempt you're more likely to succeed?
Yes, I think the best way to do that is honestly to speak with an expert or an ex-visa officer. We have heard of visa agencies overseas who have said, hey, if you pay us, this amount of money, we can get information from the embassy or consulate about exactly why your visa was refused. That is absolutely false. There is no possibility of that being truthful information. And I think people are literally just getting swindled. And so, usually when we do an Argo consultation for a client who has been refused a visa, when we get information from them about what types of questions were asked, what else happened at the interview, did the officer leave the window for a few minutes? Did they go talk to somebody else? Were there two people behind the window? Did they look into the computer for a long time? We will know immediately what happened and what the problem is. Was there a cultural miscommunication? Was there something that wasn't really understood? And this is really hard because I think for, maybe for some of your listeners, the international students can be really young, and it's hard to, take in all of the advice about exactly what to say and all of that. And we really work with each client to make sure they're prepared for any type of question. There is a lot of cultural misunderstanding, unfortunately. I always bring up this story because I just found it so interesting. But when I was working in China, I interviewed a couple that was actually going on their honeymoon. They just got married. They were planning on going to Hawaii, but they were bringing the wife's parents. The wife's parents were there interviewing, and they were going on the honeymoon too. And thankfully, I stopped and asked our local staff, which is, every consulate and embassy has staff that are from the country, they're local employees. And I was like, what is this all about? Because in America, there is no way that you would want to bring your parents or your in-laws on your honeymoon. That just does not happen. But then we found out that in China, especially Southwest China, this is actually quite common, just because older parents are nervous about going so far away where they don't speak the language. Younger people want to thank their parents for the support over the years. So everybody, they make this like group trip out of it, and it's a lot of fun for everybody. But had I not stopped and asked, I might have thought something weird or fishy was going on and probably just refused the visas. And I actually had to have a training session for other consular officers in the section who didn't know about this. So there's a lot of language, cultural miscommunication, especially when the interviews can be really short.
That's so
Awesome.
interesting. And it's so good for our listeners to hear that no matter what a company is offering you, to find out the exact reason your visa was denied, that doesn't exist. There's no secret system they can look into to find the exact reason. And it's companies like Argo, which will be able to kind of decipher and come to some sort of understanding depending on what happened in that interview for why it was rejected.
Yeah.
Kind of switching gears here, at Cambridge Network, we noticed that some of our students in Vietnam were experiencing higher rates of being rejected during their visa interviews than other markets we work with. Is this something you've noticed at all, or can you speak to some of the differences in students applying from different markets and if they experience higher rates of rejection?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. It is true. It really is dependent on the country. For some countries, there's statistics on the State Department's website. Refusal rates can be as high as 70%, for some countries. For other countries, it's relatively low. And what the State Department does is it also follows certain trends. They do a lot of investigations domestically and then also overseas. And if they see, some sort of fraud pattern or fraud trend emerging, sometimes it's hard for them not to, be a little bit more wary. And, this is why sometimes you'll hear of more refusals coming out of, China for a time or Vietnam for a time. So it really depends on what the focus of the post is on at the time.
Got it.
Awesome.
This is just so interesting, beneficial for our students to hear and to be kind of seeing behind the curtain, because I mean, I know I've applied for visas in my lifetime too, and I think it's so beneficial to hear from someone who's been doing it for so many years, and just to see behind that curtain and get some answers as to what's really going on throughout the process.
I'll tell you, it's a daunting task. As an immigrant myself, that US visa interview is you can get some sleepless nights thinking about that. So, Mandy, we appreciate you providing the insights and again, hopefully helping, our students that are applying, that will be sitting in visa interviews with some insights, because ultimately at Cambridge, and it sounds like at Argo as well, our goal is to promote international education. We're big believers in it, and we want to give these students the opportunity that so many of them so thoroughly deserve. And a big part of getting that opportunity is making sure that you're well prepared and can ultimately pass your visa interview. Mandy, I want to be conscious of time. I know you're incredibly busy at a time like this where your visas are ramping back up. Any final thoughts that you want to sort of leave with our listeners before we say goodbye to you?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to say is, if you are someone who has been refused a visa before, reach out to us. You can email us at hello@argovisa.com, or just check out our website, argovisa.com. We put videos on YouTube all the time. But if you've been refused before, don't go back in there doing exactly what you were doing before and just hope for a different result. Really work with an expert to figure out what the problem was and see if you can address it that way. Just because every single time you apply, you leave a record. And once somebody gets a certain number of refusals, it can really end up being difficult to get that visa approved.
Absolutely. And nobody better suited than Mandy and her team with all of that experience working in the industry to be able to give you those insights. Mandy, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like this conversation could have gone on for another hour, and will very, very likely, if you agree and don't run for the hills after chatting to myself and Leanna, would very likely love to have you back. So thank you so much for joining us. From myself at the Cambridge Insider Podcast and my co-host Leanna, until next time, we'll see you around the next episode. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.